Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate. All praises to Allah, the Creator of the universe and its sustainer, the provider of believers and non-believers. And may His choicest blessings be on the seal of His prophets, the last of His messengers and His holy progeny, and in particular during these days of Muharram. May His incessant blessings ever continue upon that illustrious grandson of the Holy Prophet, on Abu Abdullah Hussain, salawatullahi alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajah. Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have the opportunity to continue with our discussions looking at practical mental health lessons from the history of Karbala, looking at the speeches, the teachings, the actions of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and his great companions. We have reached a juncture in our journey together where we can move beyond the individual and specific relationships around the individual and start looking at much wider impacts. Today's topic is about service. And when we look at the scientific literature, we see a huge amount of empirical data that shows different ways in which serving other people can be of benefit to ourselves and our mental health. And when we look at the history of Karbala, we see a number of quite inspiring examples of service. Now, of course, in the Muslim community, volunteering and service has an important place. But it's not just about serving. Yes, that's important. But the how of it is also important, how we serve. So the attitude we have when we serve, both about ourselves and those whom we have the privilege of serving. Notice I use the word privilege because in the Islamic teachings, to serve is a privilege. And to have the tawfiq, to have the understanding, the awareness, and to have the opportunity to serve, because of course you need both. You need the willingness to want to serve others, as well as the opportunity to do so. And when the two combine, that is regarded as a manifestation of Allah's grace. To have that wonderful combination of intention and opportunity. But the psychology of service in Islam is quite important, because the service is such that you're supposed to serve with such humility that if you give with the right hand, the left hand is not supposed to know about it. And when we're doing wider communal service, it's supposed to be done with a sense of humility, recognizing that any good that is done is but a manifestation of Allah's hamd, that His grace, His greatness, and indeed all praise associated with that act is due to Allah alone. Now, this is not just about theological rhetoric, but it's got a really powerful psychological purpose, which is to inoculate our hearts from the infection of arrogance and pride. What Imam Sajjad alayhi salam calls in his famous Documentaries Akhlaq, he uses the term ujb. He asks for protection from ujb, which is this sense of being overly pleased with oneself. This sense of self-righteousness that comes from doing good things. So that rather than spiritually growing, we actually spiritually atrophy from having done that good work. It's quite perverse in the way it works. So in order to save us from that, we begin the act with this inoculation of rooting the work in a sense of gratitude that Allah has provided this opportunity, such that as though we are the recipients of the benefit of being able to serve others. And it's interesting that we see it that way in the Islamic teachings, because funnily enough, that's exactly what we see in the empirical scientific data. There are 5 dimensions of the scientific evidence that I'd like to cover today. But I'll do it somewhat briefly, since this particular session has been curtailed due to technical difficulties. So forgive me if I'm a little cursory when I go through the scientific studies. But very briefly, as a profession of psychologists, we've been studying service quite explicitly for about 40 years now. And for the first 20 years, we were looking at the connection between, is there a connection, a link between being a recipient of help from somebody else and our well-being, our own well-being? And studies that did wider reviews of the literature found there's actually no real link. We haven't really found any reliable, consistent relationship between receiving help and feeling better consistently. So, for the next 20 years, we flipped it around. As a profession, we started looking at the impact between giving help and feeling better, rather than receiving help. And when we turned the question on its head, when we inverted the question, suddenly everything started coming into much sharper relief. We were getting a number of studies showing statistically significant results, showing different mechanisms by which volunteering and service helps the individual who is doing that service. It's almost as though we were looking through the binoculars the wrong way around. You know how you've got, of course, two ends of a binoculars, of a pair of binoculars, and if you put it the other way around, the things you're looking at actually look further away, look more out of focus, look more distant. And when you turn the binoculars around and you look at it through the right way, suddenly everything comes into a really clear, sharp resolution. It was the same with the scientific community looking at service. When the scientists were looking at service in the same way as the Islamic teachings of akhlaq have been set out, we started seeing remarkable things. Briefly, first and foremost, volunteering predicts a consistent increase in our well-being and longevity, which is quite remarkable. Not only do you have better health, you also live longer. And when that service is given to a relationship partner, not only does that service predict reduced morbidity, but also reduced mortality. And it didn't matter, how big a service it was. What mattered was that it was done, and ideally consistently. We see, as we saw when we were looking at this study from the perspective of relationships, today when we look at it from the perspective of service, not only do we understand the science in a different way, but we also understand the Quranic verse that we were looking at in a different way. We were looking at Surah Al-Rum, Surah 30, verse 21, which said, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. In the context of a married couple, the Quran says that we've placed between them this love and mercy. And we were looking at how mawadda is not an ordinary form of love, but a selfless, service-oriented form of love. And rahmah being a compassion that creates the space for each other, to accept the deficiencies of one another, to allow space for each other to go wrong. And part of that mawadda is service, whether it's a cup of tea, whether it's helping to clean the house. We see Imam Ali alayhi salam, despite being a great warrior, took great pride and was diligent in the service he gave to his beloved wife Fatima alayhi salam in the household work. So we see that service actually is really powerful, not just in terms of close marital relationships, but also more broadly at a community level. We have a couple of studies that have found a fourth aspect of this, which is that in addition to service resulting in better mood, feeling better, it does something else as well. There is another psychological mechanism at play that has a profound impact on our mental health. And this is how service can buffer the negative effects of stress. So we've discussed previously how having a little bit of stress is good. It puts us in our peak performance, and it allows us to really produce the best that we can. But it's when stress becomes too much that we then deviate into distress and anxiety. And that can ultimately also result in depression as well. The point here is this. The data showed, and it was not just one study, it was then replicated in further studies. So it consistently, the scientific data consistently showed this buffering relationship between service and stress, so that people who had stress in their lives did not exhibit the negative effects of that stress if they were engaging in regular service. It was like the service was taking the sting out of the stress in their lives. It's not that they did not have stress in their lives. It's not like the events of their lives became magically better because they were helping other people. No, quite the contrary. In fact, it meant there was less time to do all the other things they needed to do. But they didn't experience the negative effects of that stress. And this is really powerful, because throughout our series, we've been looking at how these lessons from the history of Karbala, whether it's about relationships or about the importance of psalms and metacognition, thinking about thinking, but positive thinking, whether it's about intention and goal setting, niyyah, whichever dimension we were looking at, what was important is that it allowed us to separate negative events in our lives from our experience of those events. Service is a key technique psychologically to allow us to do that and to consistently achieve better mental health than we otherwise would. In the final study I want to look at is much broader than just mental health. There was a study in 2013 that was published in the American Journal of Public Health, which was titled "Giving to Others and the Association Between Stress and Mortality." And this was quite a large study. They had 846 participants. And they found that those people who had been serving other people during the preceding year had a reduced association between stress and mortality. It was such that stress that they experienced did not predict mortality for those people who had helped others regularly in the year before. Whereas for those people who were not engaging in service, stress predicted a 30% higher risk of mortality. Service matters. Service matters because it helps us by buffering the negative effects of stress and adversity in our lives. And we see that throughout the history of Karbala, that Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his companions were always at pains to make sure that they were able to provide to others, including the enemies. We looked a few nights ago how at Dhu Husn, the place where Imam Hussein alayhi salam encountered the army of Hur, how he requested his commander, Hazrat Abbas, his half-brother, who was given the title of the Saqi, the one who is responsible for water. And of course, historically in Arabia, the Saqi is usually the head or very senior person in the community, because the one who is responsible for water is responsible for the lives of that community. And we saw how Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam gave water not just to the army of Hur, knowing full well that these people would be combatants against them, but also to their animals, to their horses, out of compassion for these living creatures who had experienced this thirst. In addition, they went a step further to put water on their hooves. This was a level of sakayat that reached a pinnacle. But it's important to understand the context here. What we see about the service of sakayat in the history of Karbala sits within a much broader historical context of service. This notion of the Saqi actually goes back to Hazrat Qusay, who sourced water from the outskirts of Mecca for the pilgrims, for the Hujjaj who would come to Mecca, followed by Hazrat Hashim, who actually built a leather pool near Zamzam for the Hujjaj, In fact, that pool was called Bazaar. And there was something important about that. Nobody was allowed to bar anyone else from being able to drink from that. And it's with a heavy heart that we note that the descendants of this illustrious, generous person were not allowed to have water from the Euphrates in Karbala. And then Hazrat Abdul Muttalib, added to that zakayat by giving milk and sweet drinks to nourish the pilgrims. And Hazrat Abu Talib was known as Saqi al-Hujjaj, for he lined all the roads coming into Mecca with kiosks where people could quench their thirst. But Imam Ali alayhi salam took the notion of sakayat to a whole new level, when at the Battle of Badr, he alone had the courage to descend down into the well in the darkness of the night to bring water for Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam was the representative of Imam Ali alayhi salam in Karbala. So the sakayat, the service of water that Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam provided, was in the footsteps of Imam Ali alayhi salam as his representative. And this is why that service of giving water to the enemies and to the animals is so important. It put a seal on the notion of sakayat throughout history. Now, when we try and apply this to our own lives, it raises a couple of questions. How do we do that? And of course, we're looking at service in the second half of our discussions. In my academic research, looking at both psychotherapy from a clinical sense, as well as Islamic teachings from a theological sense, there are 10 points of contact that I have found. 5 for self-knowledge, metacognition, 5 for building resilience. And this aspect of service is key for building resilience. But it doesn't work in isolation. This is why it was important to lay the foundation of the other dimensions. Firstly, with regard to goal setting. Because when we establish a goal to serve others, it changes the energy dynamic, both within ourselves and our communication. Secondly, the resilience that is required in the face of adversity for these kind of challenges of serving others are quite different to the kind of resilience-related challenges we face for private, personal projects. So we need to think again about our staying power. Often, service is a thankless task. Serving others is not necessarily met with accolade and applaud, but is often met with harsh criticism. And so being able to deal with that sense of self, how we view ourselves in light of the criticism we get from others as we try to serve them, is quite a salient personal development exercise. Mindfulness becomes really important. We were looking earlier in this discussion about how service is important in the Islamic teachings. But we begin the service with a thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the opportunity to serve. Now that mindfulness, that remaining in the present moment, is what transforms that service into ibadah, into worship. Because as we serve with presence of mind, we do so in recognition of us being vehicles for grace, of rahmah, becoming vehicles of rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This, as we discussed previously, is the kind of grace that is generic, applies to everyone and everything. And to be a vessel for that kind of grace is a great privilege, but it requires mindfulness in the present moment, particularly as a shield against thoughts of pride and ujb, as we were talking about earlier. And we saw how gratitude was important at the beginning of the act, but also when we finish the act of service, it's important to give thanks for having been able to complete that act of service, so that we round the whole event off, beginning with thanks, ending with thanks. With regard to optimism and hope, it's important to be able to maintain that optimism in the face of the adversity of criticism. And that hope is not just a hope for ourselves, but indeed a hope for the people we're trying to serve, to see a greater outcome for themselves than they can see for themselves sometimes. And we see that repeatedly in the history of Karbala through Imam Hussein alayhi salam in his service of teaching. He remained the Imam of all of creation right up to his last breath. Right up to his last moment, he was teaching. He was serving even those who were trying to kill him. He was giving them teachings about the folly of what they were doing and about the importance of looking at salvation more broadly, not succumbing to the payment that they had been promised as mercenaries of Yazid. Teaching is an incredibly powerful and compassionate form of service. And we see the Imam alayhi salam engaging in this throughout his journey, from the time he left Medina all the way through to the final hours on the day of Ashura. But in order to achieve our objectives for service, the way we think about relationships is different to the way we were thinking about it a few days ago. A few days ago, the approach to relationships was how we may have greater resources for dealing with the adversity around us. But today, when we think about it in terms of service, this is about joining hands with others so that what we can collectively deliver to the people is greater than the sum of the individual parts. So that if I serve and you serve separately, individually, we can achieve more if we serve together. We may be able to give more service to the people and more benefit to the community as a whole, to the community at large. And we see many aspects of this kind of service in the history of Karbala, particularly with regard to people who were not well known for their affinity to the Ahlulbayt al-Islam. And I'm thinking particularly of people like Khur, who we remembered more recently, as well as Zuhair bin Qayn, who we looked at in the early parts of our discussions. You know, individuals who came to the path of Imam Hussein because they were inspired by the service that he was engaging in, the service being Islah fi ummati jaddi, the reform, the transformation of the community of his grandfather. Because people could see, people like Khur, people like Zuhair, could see just how far the community had deviated into supporting a despot like Yazid. So relationships becomes quite important, but anxiety also changes. We see in the Holy Quran the example of Zakaria, Surah 19 verse 5, where he says, وَإِنِّي خِفْتُ الْمَوَالِيَ مِنْ وَرَائِي وَكَانَتْ امْرَأَتِي عَاقِرًا فَهَبْ لِي مِنْ لَدُنْكَ وَلِيًّا. He says, فَإِنِّي خِفْتُ, I am anxious. And he was talking about, his anxiety about those who would succeed him, because he didn't have an heir. And he and his wife had reached quite an elderly age, beyond typically the childbearing years. And so he was really anxious about what would happen to his community after him. It was a genuine concern. And we see that he predicated the discussion about anxiety with a clear statement of his faith, where he says, وَلَمْ أَكُنْ بِدُعَائِكَ رَبِّ شَقِيًّا, that never has my call to you been unheeded. And this is really important, because even though he had to wait a long time for his wish to be granted, each time he asked, he felt he was answered, particularly by being given the strength to continue to serve, even though he didn't have visibility on what would happen to the future of his community. It is therefore with a really heavy heart that we remember the sacrifice of the Saqqa in Karbala, of Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam. It is narrated that towards the end of the afternoon, when all the companions had been martyred, Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam hears the call of Al-Atash, the great thirst, from Bibi Sakina alayhi salam, the 4-year-old daughter of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, and the other children. And he asks for permission to go and to get water. Imam Hussain alayhi salam says, "How can I let you go? You are the commander of my army." Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam responds that there is no army left, O Master. Imam Hussain alayhi salam says, "If you go, leave your sword behind. For you are such a swordsman that you will vanquish this army." And he gives him just the lance with the banner to go forward. As Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam goes forward, the army become frightened because they knew the valor of Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam. And they offer him amnesty because of distant relationship, family kin. He says, "Woe to your amnesty. How can there be amnesty for me without amnesty of for the grandson of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him? Give water to his children." And Shimr responds, "Even if the earth had been covered with water, we would not give one drop unless he gives bay'ah to Yazid." Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam fights his way to the Furat, and he fills the water skins with water, but does not take even one drop, one sip for himself. As he approaches back to the camp of Imam Hussain, fighting through the ranks, 2 cowards, Zayd bin Ruq'ad and Hakim bin al-Tufail, hide in the trees, and they pounce upon him, severing each of his arms. He calls out, "By Allah, if you cut off my right hand, I shall not cease defending my religion. And Imam, true to his conviction, do I serve, a son of the trustworthy Prophet whom Allah did send." And as he continues, Hurmala fires an arrow at the water skin he was protecting. And as the water skin rips, Hazrat Abbas's hopes drain away of giving water to Bibi Sakina. As he's hit on the head, he falls to the ground. He calls out to his final salams to Hazrat Abbas, to Imam Hussain alayhi salam, who arrives at his side. He asks his beloved brother Abbas for his final wasiyah, and he says only 2 things. "Please, can you remove the blood from my eyes so I can see you one final time, and leave me here. Do not carry me to the campsite, for you've been carrying bodies all day." As Hazrat Abbas passes away, Imam Hussain calls out, "Al-an inkasara dhahri." Now my back has been broken. And he returns alone to the camp with the flag of Hazrat Abbas. Ala la'natullahi ala dhalimeen. Wa saya'lamu alladhina dhalamu ayya munqalibin yanqalibun. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Let us pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He inspires us to serve in the spirit of Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam, and He keeps us faithful to the Imam of our time. Surah Al-Mubarakatul Fatiha.